Hello everybody, how you guys doing? In this video, we're gonna talk about converting between degrees and radians. All right, so here we go. I've got this blank template, and let's go ahead and we're going to add in a Cartesian plane with a circle, and we've got an initial side here. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is let's just label these degrees. Then we're going to go ahead and label the radians, so that way we can just have our minds in the right mindset for what it's going to mean to convert between these two. So along our initial side here, the way where we always start is 0 degrees. So I'm going to put 0 degrees here. And then we always go counterclockwise, okay, in mathematics. So we are going to go along the circle in a counterclockwise manner until we get up to this point right here. And actually, I should put this point here. So we get up to this point right here. And so from the initial side up to this side right here, that is a 90-degree angle. So we have just traveled 90 degrees. And then if we continue along this circle, we get down to this point right here, which is 180 degrees. And then if we continue further, we get down to the lower point here, which is 270 degrees. And again, I'm doing this by adding 90 degrees plus 90 degrees plus 90 degrees. And then finally, we're going to continue on to get all the way back to our starting point, which is a total of 360 degrees. So actually, the starting point is also the ending point. These are actually what we call coterminal. So it can be referred to as 0 degrees or 360 degrees. All right. Okay, so now let's go ahead and we're going to do the exact same thing, except we're going to do it with radians. And so I'm going to start here. And radians, the units we use for radians, well, it's like a combination of units. It's really a number, right, that we use with radians, and it's always related to pi. Okay, so if we start at this initial point here, in radians, I would call this 0 pi radians, and I'll put RADS for radians. So it's 0 radians, right? 0 degrees, 0 radians. I'm just going to put a pi in there because it's actually 0 pi radians. And I'm actually going to skip the 90 degrees when I go counterclockwise. I'm going to go all the way down around to 180 degrees, because at 180 degrees, this is 1 pi radians. All right, or just pi. You could just say pi radians, okay? And now I'm actually going to go backwards. If I started at 0 over at the initial side, and then I got to pi radians over at 180 degrees, then halfway in between must have been pi over 2 radians. So at 90 degrees, we have pi over 2 radians. Okay? So here we go. 0 pi radians, pi over 2 radians, pi radians, or 1 pi radians. And I'm going to, again, skip the 270 because it's easier for us to think of it this way. I'm going to go all the way around. So if one half was pi radians, then another half must have been 2 pi radians. So at 360 degrees, we have 2 pi radians. And I'm going to go backwards again at the 270, and I'll say, well, what's between 2 pi and 1 pi? Well, that's 1.5 pi radians, but we always write that as a fraction, and that would be 3 over 2 is equal to 1/2. So it would be 3 pi over 2 radians. Okay. All right, so now we're pretty much ready to go. We're in the right mindset to start to figure out how can we convert from degrees to radians and vice versa. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a ratio. And so this ratio is actually going to, you can actually choose any point on this circle and figure out what the degrees and the radians are, and do the same thing. But I think it's easiest to start or to use 1 pi radians and 180 degrees, because one of these is already 1, right? We have 1 pi. So what this essentially is saying is that pi radians is equivalent to 180 degrees. Okay? And I could put the little degrees symbol up there. But what we're going to do is we're going to use this relationship. All right? And we're going to use it in a kind of a similar way to where you would say like 1 mile per hour. Well, that's actually written out as 1 mile per 1 hour. Okay, so it's going to be kind of similar to that, but I'm not going to skip any steps in between so you guys can see exactly how I came up with it. So here we go. So if I said that pi radians, and I'll put pi radians, is equal to 180 degrees. All right. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually divide both sides by one of the sides. So I'm actually going to divide both sides by 180 degrees. 180 degrees. And it's important, I'm writing out these units because it's important for us to recognize that there are units here. So divided by 180 degrees. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to kind of erase this in a second just to save space. But 180 degrees divided by 180 degrees is 1, right? And the ratio on the other side is pi radians over 180 degrees. So I'm going to actually get rid of that, and I'm just going to write out the solution here. So when I divide both sides by 180 degrees, I basically get pi radians over 180 degrees. Right? And that's equivalent to 1 because 180 degrees over 180 degrees is just 1. So we're going to use this later, all right, because I can multiply anything by 1, right? So, and again, there are actual units here that we are going to be canceling out as well, but I'm going to go ahead and whenever you see pi, you basically know that you're talking about radians, and 180 degrees would, yeah, we'd probably put the symbol up here, but just a number would be in degrees, okay? Now, I'm going to do the exact same thing, but in this case, on both sides, I'm going to divide both sides from this original. I'm going to divide both sides by pi radians. So on the left, I'm going to get 1. And on the right, I'm going to get 180 degrees over pi. So yeah, so this is basically our relationship that we just came up with without really skipping any steps, and just understand that there are actual units associated with these. And so what we're going to do is, when we convert, is we're going to basically choose between one of these two. And the way that you choose, at least the way that I choose, is I kind of think, well, if I'm going to radians, if I want to end up with radians, then there better be a pi in there. So I would actually choose this one because I would be multiplying a pi in. If I'm going to degrees, then degrees does not have pi's. So I would end up choosing this one because I would be dividing a pi out. Okay, so let's use a couple of examples to see how that looks. All right, so first example, we are going to go from degrees to radians. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one of these just to make sure that it works. So let's go with 270 degrees. So I'm going to say I want to convert 270 degrees to radians. So what am I going to multiply by? Pi over 180 or 180 over pi? And the answer is, well, I'm going to radians, so there had better be a pi left over. I'm going to be multiplying a pi into this thing. And so since this one would be dividing a pi out, I'm going to choose this guy right here, which is multiplying a pi in. Okay, so I'm going to multiply by pi over 180. All right. And so when I actually do this, this is, I end up with 270 pi over 180. And 270 divided by 180 when I simplify is 3 pi over 2. All right, and is that correct? Is 270 degrees equivalent to 3 pi over 2? Well, let's take a look over here, and we did have that labeled. 270 degrees is the same thing as 3 pi over 2 radians. All right, let's go the other way, and this one is going to be, we're going to go from radians to degrees. And in this case, I'm going to choose, let's go from pi over 2 radians. So I'm going to say, okay, what is pi over 2 radians in degrees? And so again, I have to choose up here. Am I going to choose the pi over 180 or pi, 180 over pi? In this case, I'm going to end up with degrees. So I want to remove a pi. So I'm going to be dividing this pi out. So I'm going to choose 180 over pi. So I'm going to multiply by 180 over pi. And you can see when I multiply across, not skipping any steps here, I end up with 180 pi over 2 pi. And these pi's are going to cancel. giving me 180 divided by 2, which is 90 degrees. So pi over 2 is equivalent to 90 degrees, and let's go ahead and check over here, and that is correct. So what's the moral of the story here? Well, if you understand degrees and radians, then really all you really need to remember is 180 and pi. And in order to choose between these two relationships, the way I do it at least, is I decide, hey, do I need to divide a pi out of this to get rid of my pi's, or do I need to multiply a pi in um, to give a pi, essentially, to get radians out of there? All right. Yeah, there we go. And so those are the different types or different ways to convert between degrees and radians.